They say the truth will set you free, but they never talk about the devastation it leaves in its wake. Sometimes, the truth isn't a key that unlocks a door to freedom, but a sledgehammer, shattering everything you once believed was solid and real. For Amelia Vance, this truth arrived not in a sudden flash of light, but in the chilling quiet of her own living room, a room so grand and ornate it was often featured in magazines, yet a room that had never once felt like home. The air, usually scented with the faint perfume of lilies Eleanor insisted upon, was thick with something else tonight. It was the scent of betrayal, a cold and sterile odor that clung to the velvet curtains and polished marble floors. She stood opposite her husband, Thomas, the man whose gentle eyes and easy laugh had once been her entire world. Tonight, those eyes were dull, avoiding her gaze, fixed on a point somewhere over her shoulder. And beside him, perched on the edge of a silk armchair like a vulture waiting for the kill, was his mother, Eleanor, the matriarch of the Vance family, a woman forged from steel and ambition, whose smile never quite reached her cold, calculating eyes. The silence was a weapon in itself, stretching until Amelia felt her nerves might snap. Then Thomas spoke, and his voice, once a source of comfort, was a monotone, stripped of all warmth, as if the words were not his own. "I want a DNA test," he said. He didn't look at her. "For Leo." The name of their newborn son, a name they had chosen together during a sun-drenched afternoon that now felt like a lifetime ago, sounded alien and clinical coming from his lips. Amelia didn't flinch. She didn't gasp. The shock was too profound, a deep, internal tremor that bypassed all the usual expressions of pain. It was as if she was watching a scene from a movie, and her body had forgotten its role. Thomas continued, his words a clumsy recitation of the poison Eleanor had been dripping into his ear for weeks. He spoke of her friend, David, of his visits, of the impropriety of their long-standing friendship. Each word was a betrayal, a twisting of something innocent into something ugly and unrecognizable. Amelia's gaze drifted from the stranger who was her husband to the triumphant smirk playing on Eleanor's lips. And in that moment, she understood everything. This wasn't about doubt. This was a coup, a carefully orchestrated move to finally excise her, the outsider, from the pristine lineage of the Vance family. They had expected tears, denials, a hysterical breakdown. They had expected a victim. But the woman they had pushed to the edge was not the same woman they had welcomed into their gilded cage. The heartbreak was so immense, it burned away all weakness, leaving behind something hard and clear and dangerous. A quiet resolve settled over her, cold and heavy. She met Eleanor's gaze across the room, a silent acknowledgement of the war that had just been declared. Then, she turned her eyes to Thomas, her voice steady, betraying none of the chaos raging inside her. "Fine," she said, the single word hanging in the air with the finality of a gavel's strike. "I'll do it." And in the chilling stillness of that opulent room, the game had begun. It seems like a lifetime ago, but Amelia could still remember the smell of turpentine and linseed oil that used to cling to her clothes, a perfume of her own making, the scent of her independence. Before she was a Vance, she was simply Amelia, a painter whose world was a chaotic, beautiful mess of canvases and color. Her small, sunlit studio in the city was her kingdom, a place where the only rules were the ones she set for herself, where her worth was measured not by her family name, but by the raw emotion she could spill onto a canvas. She came from a family of teachers and librarians, a world of modest means but abundant love and intellectual curiosity. She was taught that a person's value was in their character, their integrity, and the passion they brought to their life's work. It was a philosophy that felt as natural to her as breathing, until she met Thomas Vance. Their meeting was something out of a storybook, a cliché she would have found laughable in her previous life. He had wandered into a small gallery, showcasing her work, a man impeccably dressed, but with a lost look in his eyes. He wasn't like the usual art critics or buyers. He didn't speak of technique or market value. He spoke of how a particular shade of blue in her painting of a stormy sea made him feel, how it captured a loneliness he knew all too well. He was the heir to the Vance financial empire, a name synonymous with old money and ruthless power, yet in that small gallery, he was just a man, captivated by her art. For Amelia, he was a revelation. He was gentle, attentive, and seemed genuinely fascinated by her world, a world so vastly different from his own. He loved her passion, her freedom, the paint smudges that were perpetually on her hands. To him, she was authentic, a vibrant splash of color in his monochromatic life of boardrooms and black-tie galas. The courtship was a whirlwind. He pursued her with a single-minded devotion that swept her off her feet. He promised her that their love was a world of its own, a sanctuary that would be impervious to the pressures of his family. Amelia, an optimist and a romantic at heart, believed him. She fell deeply in love, not with the Vance fortune, but with the quiet, soulful man she thought she knew. When he proposed, she said yes, believing that their bond was strong enough to withstand any storm. The wedding itself should have been a warning. It was a magnificent, soulless affair, orchestrated entirely by Eleanor Vance. Amelia had wanted a small, intimate ceremony, but she was gently, inexorably overruled. She walked down the aisle of a cavernous cathedral, wearing a designer gown that felt like a costume, smiling at hundreds of strangers whose names she would never remember. She felt less like a bride and more like the newest, most prized acquisition of the Vance family. And at the center of this new universe was Eleanor. From their very first meeting, Eleanor had regarded Amelia with a thinly veiled condescension. She never said a cruel word directly. Her attacks were far more insidious, wrapped in the guise of well-meaning advice. She would compliment Amelia's dress while suggesting a more appropriate designer. She would praise her artistic talent, but lament that it was a charming, but ultimately frivolous pursuit for the wife of a Vance. She called Amelia's parents delightful, simple people, the words hanging in the air with the weight of a judgment. Eleanor's world was one of bloodlines, legacies, and strategic alliances. Love was a secondary, almost irrelevant, factor in a marriage. Amelia, with her middle-class background and her impractical profession, was a disruption to the carefully curated Vance narrative, a variable Eleanor was determined to control or, if necessary, eliminate. Life in the Vance mansion was an exercise in slow suffocation. It was a gilded cage of breathtaking beauty and suffocating rules. The sprawling estate had dozens of rooms, but none of them felt like hers. The decor was exquisite, chosen by Eleanor. The meals were gourmet, planned by Eleanor. The staff were polite and efficient, but their loyalty was to Eleanor. Amelia's friends, with their loud laughter and unconventional jobs, were never invited back after their first awkward dinner party. She was given a magnificent, state-of-the-art studio on the third floor, a generous gift from Thomas. But it felt less like a gesture of support and more like a means of containment, a place to keep her messy, artistic identity safely tucked away from the pristine, orderly life of the family. That studio became her only refuge, the only place she could close the door, blast music, and feel the familiar comfort of a paintbrush in her hand. It was the only place in the entire mansion where she could still feel like herself. Thomas, caught in the middle, was a constant source of both comfort and disappointment. In the privacy of their rooms, he would hold her, apologize for his mother's behavior, and swear that he loved her more than anything. He would promise to speak to Eleanor, to set boundaries. But Amelia soon learned that these promises were hollow. In his mother's powerful presence, Thomas would transform. He would become quiet, agreeable, his spine seemingly dissolving. He was a good man, but he was a weak man, terrified of disappointing the woman who held the purse strings and, more importantly, the key to his sense of self-worth. Amelia began to see that she wasn't just married to Thomas. She was in a battle with Eleanor for his very soul, and it was a battle she was slowly, heartbreakingly losing. The fairy tale had crumbled, the romance replaced by a quiet, gnawing loneliness. She was Mrs. Thomas Vance, living a life of unimaginable luxury, but she had never felt more impoverished. The gilded cage was secure, the door was locked, and with the news of her pregnancy, she could feel the final bar dropping into place. The birth of Leo should have been a joyous beginning, a moment to heal the quiet fractures in their marriage, and for a fleeting moment, it was. When Amelia first held her son, the vast, cold mansion seemed to disappear. There was only the warmth of his small body against hers. his tiny fingers curled around one of hers. In that hospital room, when Thomas looked at them, his eyes filled with a genuine, unadulterated love. Amelia allowed herself to hope. She believed this child, this perfect fusion of their two worlds, would be the anchor that would finally secure their family against the relentless tide of his mother's influence. But hope is a fragile thing in the house of Vance. The moment Eleanor swept into the room, draped in cashmere and a scent of expensive perfume that seemed to suck all the air out, the sanctity of that moment was broken. She didn't coo over the baby with the simple joy of a new grandmother. She inspected him. She scrutinized his features, declaring with satisfaction, "Ah, the Vance ears, and that jawline. He is a true Vance, through and through." It was a pronouncement, a branding. In her eyes, Amelia was merely the vessel, a necessary but ultimately unimportant part of the process of producing an heir. That was the beginning of the siege. Eleanor's interference was a masterclass in psychological warfare. She never raised her voice. She never made a direct accusation. Her methods were far more insidious. She questioned Amelia's maternal instincts at every turn, always under the guise of helpfulness. When Amelia chose to breastfeed, Eleanor would leave articles on her nightstand about the superior nutritional matrix of a particular, astronomically expensive brand of European formula. She hired a team of nurses without Amelia's consent, creating a barrier around the baby and making Amelia feel like a guest in her own nursery. Every decision Amelia made, from the color of the baby's blankets to the lullabies she sang, was met with a gentle, undermining suggestion from Eleanor. The constant refrain was always about legacy, about how things were done in this family. She was slowly, systematically eroding Amelia's confidence, isolating her in the fog of postpartum exhaustion and turning the joy of motherhood into a daily performance review. She was destined to fail. It was in this state of profound isolation that Amelia reached out to David, her old friend, her confidant from a life that felt a million miles away. When he came to visit, it was like a window had been thrown open in a stale, suffocating room. David didn't walk on eggshells. He made her laugh, a real, deep laugh that had become a foreign sound in the mansion's hallowed halls. He didn't care about the Vance name or the intimidating decor. He saw his friend, tired and struggling, and he treated her like a person, not a porcelain doll. He held Leo not as an heir, but as a beautiful baby, marveling at his tiny features. He talked to Amelia about art, about new exhibits, about the world outside the gilded cage. His presence was a reminder of the woman she used to be, the woman she still was, somewhere deep inside. For a few hours, she wasn't Mrs. Vance. She was just Amelia, and the relief was so overwhelming it brought tears to her eyes. And Eleanor watched it all. Every laugh, every shared memory, every comforting touch was catalogued and filed away, ready to be weaponized. She saw Amelia's vulnerability and David's platonic affection, and with the skill of a master manipulator, she began to twist it into something ugly. She would enter the room at precisely the right moment, when David, seeing Amelia's exhaustion, had a comforting hand on her shoulder. She would take a photograph with her phone, ostensibly of the baby, but the framing would artfully capture the two of them in the background, their proximity looking far more intimate than it was. Her comments to Thomas later that evening were surgical strikes, delivered with an air of innocent concern. "Amelia seems so much happier when her friend is here," she would muse, her voice laced with meaning. "It's wonderful she has such close support. He has a way with Leo, doesn't he? Almost paternal." She planted the seeds, watering them with innuendo and feigned worry. Slowly, inevitably, the poison took root. Thomas, already grappling with the pressures of his new role as a father and the immense weight of his family's expectations, was fertile ground for his mother's campaign. He would come home from a grueling day at the office to find Eleanor waiting with a fresh anecdote, a carefully cropped photo, a sigh of concern. He began to see David not as a friend, but as a rival. The easy happiness Amelia shared with David was a stark contrast to the strained silence that now often filled their own conversations. His insecurity, expertly stoked by Eleanor, curdled into suspicion. The questions started, first casually, then with a sharp edge. Why does David need to come over so often? What could you possibly have to talk about for 3 hours? You need to be more careful, Amelia. People in our position can't afford to be naive. Tongues will wag. Each question was a small crack in the foundation of their marriage. Amelia would defend herself, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and hurt, but her denials only seemed to confirm his suspicions. He was no longer listening to her. He was listening to the insidious whisper of doubt his mother had planted in his mind, a whisper that was now growing into a roar. The true tragedy was that he didn't even realize the voice he was hearing wasn't his own. The weeks that followed were a slow, agonizing descent into a cold war. The vast mansion, once just lonely, now felt actively hostile. Every creak of a floorboard, every whisper from the staff down the long hallways sounded like an accusation. Thomas was a ghost in his own home, moving through rooms with a heavy silence, his presence a constant, painful reminder of the chasm that had opened between them. He rarely met her eyes, and when he did, they were filled with a murky blend of anger and sorrow, clouded by the poison his mother had so expertly administered. He was a man drowning in a sea of doubt, and instead of reaching for the life raft of their shared history and love, he was clinging to the anchor of his mother's suspicions. Amelia felt as though she were holding her breath, waiting for the final, inevitable blow to fall. She knew it was coming. Eleanor was not a woman who left a task half-finished. She had planted the seed, nurtured the growth of suspicion, and now it was time for the harvest. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday, a day as gray and oppressive as the mood within the house. The instrument of destruction was, ironically, an act of kindness. David, knowing Amelia was struggling, had sent a small, handcrafted silver rattle for Leo. It was a beautiful, personal gift, engraved with the baby's initials and a tiny star. He had sent it directly to Amelia, a simple gesture from one friend to another, but in the hands of Eleanor, it became a smoking gun. She intercepted the package, her methods as ruthlessly efficient as ever, and presented it to Thomas in his mahogany-paneled study that evening. She didn't have to say much. She simply placed the small box on his desk. "This arrived for Amelia today," she said, her voice a careful mixture of concern and sorrow. "From her friend, Mr. Holloway. It's a rather intimate gift, don't you think? It's the sort of thing a father might give his son." That was all it took. When Thomas summoned Amelia to the study, she walked in knowing this was it. The trap had been set, and she was walking into it. Eleanor was there, of course, seated in a leather wingback chair, the picture of a concerned matriarch, forced to witness an unpleasant but necessary confrontation. The air was thick with judgment. Thomas stood by the fireplace, the silver rattle in his hand, his face a mask of cold fury. He began speaking, his voice tight and controlled, but the words were not his. They were Eleanor's, sharpened and polished, delivered through her son. He spoke of his duty to the Vance name, the importance of an untarnished legacy, the need for absolute certainty. He laid out the evidence, the frequent visits, the long conversations, the out-of-context photographs his mother had so conveniently captured, and now, this silver rattle, which he held up as if it were a murder weapon. Amelia stood silent, absorbing each word like a physical blow. She did not cry, she did not argue. To do so would be to grant legitimacy to the farce, to engage in the twisted reality they had constructed. She simply watched the man she had loved perform this final act of betrayal. And as he spoke, something inside her shifted. It was a quiet, profound, and irreversible transformation. The part of her that had held on to hope, the part that still loved the gentleman he once was, simply died. It wasn't a violent death. It was a quiet, cold extinguishing of a flame, leaving behind an unnerving calm. The hurt was so immense, it had burned through all other emotions, leaving only a steely resolve. She was no longer fighting for her marriage. She was fighting for her son and for her own name. When he finally ran out of rehearsed words, he delivered the ultimatum, the phrase that had been hanging in the air for weeks. "For the good of this family, for the sake of the Vance legacy," he said, his eyes finally meeting hers, hard and unforgiving, "I am demanding a paternity test." He expected a collapse. Eleanor expected hysterics. They were prepared for a scene, for pleas and denials. What they got instead was silence. Amelia let the words settle in the oppressive quiet of the room. She looked from Thomas's strained face to Eleanor's smug, triumphant one. She saw the checkmate they thought they had achieved. And then she spoke. Her voice was not the voice of a victim. It was level, clear, and devoid of any emotion. It was the voice of a stranger. "All right," she said. The single word stunned them into momentary confusion. She took a step forward. "I will agree to your test, but there are conditions." She held their gaze, her newfound strength, a palpable force in the room. "First, I will be the one to choose the laboratory. It will be a neutral, highly respected facility outside of this state, with no ties to this family or your companies. Second, I will arrange the appointment. And third, and this is not negotiable, the results will be sent to me, and only to me. I will be the first person to see them. Those are my terms." Thomas and Eleanor exchanged a look. Amelia's calm acceptance, her businesslike negotiation, was not what they had anticipated. But their arrogance led them to a simple, fatal miscalculation. They saw her conditions not as a power play, but as the desperate maneuvering of a guilty party trying to control the inevitable fallout. They believed she was simply buying time, preparing for her exile. They thought she had already accepted her defeat. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Eleanor's lips as she gave Thomas a slight nod. "That seems acceptable," Thomas said, trying to regain his footing, to reassert his authority. They believed they had won. They believed the game was over. They had no idea that by agreeing to her terms, they had just handed her the very weapon she would use to dismantle their entire world. Amelia simply nodded once, turned, and walked out of the study, the solid click of the closing door echoing behind her like the cocking of a gun. The days following the ultimatum were lived in a state of suspended animation. The opulent Vance mansion became a mausoleum, haunted by the ghosts of what might have been. Conversations were reduced to clipped, necessary exchanges about the baby's schedule or household logistics. Thomas and Amelia moved around each other like strangers, the space between them crackling with unspoken words and bitter resentments. To an outsider, Amelia appeared broken. She was quiet, subdued, her eyes often distant. She moved through her days with a mechanical grace, tending to Leo, speaking politely to the staff, and enduring Eleanor's looks of smug satisfaction. They saw a woman preparing for her inevitable exile, a player who had been checkmated and was merely waiting for the king to be tipped over. But beneath that placid, defeated surface, a new kind of mind was at work. The heart of the artist, once driven by passion and intuition, was now cold, sharp, and analytical. Her trust had been atomized, and in its place was a clarity so profound it was terrifying. She was no longer a wife fighting for her marriage. She was a strategist in a war she had never wanted. And she was beginning to understand that the first rule of warfare is to know your enemy. While she went through the meticulous, painful process of researching and contacting a top-tier genetics laboratory in another state, her senses were on high alert. She had spent years passively absorbing the Vance family history, the curated anecdotes Eleanor would tell at dinner parties about her late husband, the great patriarch Arthur Vance Sr. Before, she had accepted these stories as gospel. Now, she replayed them in her mind, searching for the cracks. She noticed how Eleanor's praise for her husband was always broad and sweeping, focusing on his business acumen and his public legacy, but rarely on personal, intimate details. She noticed how any mention of his younger brother, Richard Vance, was quickly glossed over. Richard was the charming, slightly roguish black sheep of the family, and was always treated with a strange mixture of affection and dismissal. The catalyst, the moment of vague unease solidified into a sharp, actionable suspicion, came from a place of deep memory. The library. It was Arthur Vance's sanctuary, a room paneled in dark wood and smelling of old leather and cigar smoke, a room Amelia had always found oppressive. One afternoon, looking for a children's book she had stored away, she pulled a heavy, leather-bound photo album from a bottom shelf. It was from before her time, filled with pictures from Thomas's childhood. She saw a young Eleanor, stunningly beautiful and radiating ambition. She saw Arthur Sr., a stern, imposing man who even in photographs seemed to be judging the viewer. And she saw Thomas as a boy, a child with his father's serious expression. But as she turned the pages, she stopped at a candid photograph taken at a family garden party. It showed Arthur and his brother Richard, standing side by side, laughing. For the first time, Amelia really looked, at the two men. And then she looked at a portrait of her husband, Thomas, that sat on the mantel. The family had always said Thomas was the spitting image of his mother, and it was true to an extent. But looking at the photograph of the two brothers, a chilling realization dawned on her. Thomas shared none of Arthur's distinct features, not the sharp line of his nose, not the shape of his ears. But when she looked at Richard, the charming, charismatic uncle, she saw it. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The curve of the smile, the way the eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, the set of the jawline. It was a ghost of a resemblance, a whisper of a connection, but in the hyper-vigilant state of Amelia's mind, it screamed at her. The whisper became a roar a few nights later. During one of their tense, mostly silent dinners, Eleanor was agitated about some minor failing of the kitchen staff. Flustered, she turned to Thomas, who was listlessly pushing food around his plate. "Richard, for heaven's sake, will you not tell the chef that the—" She stopped abruptly. The name hung in the dead air of the dining room for a split second. An impossible, damning thing. A flicker of pure, unadulterated panic crossed Eleanor's face before her mask of aristocratic composure slammed back into place. She laughed it off, a brittle, unconvincing sound. "Oh my goodness, listen to me, a senior moment. I must be more tired than I thought." Thomas didn't seem to register it, lost in his own misery. But Amelia saw it. She saw the slip, and she saw the terror in Eleanor's eyes. A photograph and a slip of the tongue. In her old life, she would have dismissed them as coincidence. In her new reality, they were pieces of a puzzle she was suddenly desperate to solve. That night, she sat in her studio, the lights off, the city glowing in the distance. The truth about Leo's paternity would exonerate her, yes, but it wouldn't give her freedom. It would only make her a woman scorned, a vindictive wife in their narrative. They would use their immense wealth and power to paint her as unstable, to fight her for custody of Leo, to ruin her reputation so thoroughly that no one would ever believe her. Winning this one battle was not enough. To truly protect her son, to truly escape, she had to burn their kingdom to the ground. And to do that, she needed an incendiary truth, a secret so foundational that its revelation would shatter the entire Vance legacy. She unlocked a small metal box where she kept the cash she'd earned from a gallery sale just before her wedding, a sum she had kept separate as her own private safety net. She took out a new, untraceable phone she had bought for cash a week earlier. With steady hands, she began to search for a very specific kind of professional. Her meeting with Marcus Thorne, a private investigator, took place in a noisy, anonymous coffee shop halfway across the city. He was a man who blended into the background, with patient eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Amelia, dressed in jeans and a hoodie, her hair tucked under a baseball cap, must have looked like 1,000 other women. But when she spoke, her voice was firm, her instructions precise. She didn't tell him her name. She didn't tell him her story. She simply slid a thick envelope of cash across the table. "I need you to investigate someone," she said. "Eleanor Vance. I want to know everything about her life, specifically in the year leading up to her son's birth, and the 2 years following. Who she saw, where she went, who her confidants were. I want letters, records, whispers, everything." Thorne looked at the envelope, then at her, his expression unreadable. "This is a very powerful family," he said, his voice low. "It will be expensive, and it will be dangerous." Amelia met his gaze without flinching. "I am aware," she replied, "and I am prepared. Discretion is the only thing I require." He nodded slowly, then slid the envelope into his coat. The silent investigation had officially begun, a dark river flowing beneath a house built on lies, and as Amelia walked out into the anonymous city crowds, she felt not fear, but the cold, thrilling resolve of a woman who had nothing left to lose. The appointment at the genetics facility was a study in sterile misery. Amelia had chosen a discreet, highly regarded clinic in a neighboring state, a 2-hour drive from the Vance estate. The journey was made in absolute silence, a vacuum of unspoken accusations and dead affection. Thomas drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Amelia sat in the passenger seat, looking out the window, watching the world go by as if from behind a thick wall of glass. In the back, Leo slept peacefully in his car seat, blissfully unaware that he was the subject of this cold, clinical pilgrimage. The clinic itself was impersonal and efficient, a place of clean lines, quiet hums of machinery, and hushed voices. There was no judgment in the eyes of the technician, only a practiced neutrality as she took the simple cheek swabs from a stone-faced Thomas, a stoic Amelia, and a momentarily fussy Leo. The entire process took less than 15 minutes, a swift and bloodless procedure that nonetheless felt like the final, brutal violation of their family. It was a formal acknowledgement that the trust which forms the sacred core of a marriage had been excised, and all that remained was a need for scientific proof. The week that followed was the longest of Amelia's life. The waiting was a unique form of torture, a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety beneath the surface of her carefully constructed calm. At home, she continued to play the part of the vanquished wife. She was quiet, compliant, and kept to herself and the nursery. Eleanor's smugness had reached its zenith. She now spoke of Amelia's future in the past tense, making veiled comments to Thomas about moving forward and restoring order to the household. Thomas remained a ghost, his guilt and suspicion making him sullen and withdrawn. He seemed incapable of even looking at his own son, as if Leo were a living embodiment of his doubt. But while her outward demeanor was one of passive defeat, Amelia's inner world was a hive of activity. Every spare moment, she would retreat to her studio, lock the door, and pull out the burner phone. She checked her secure email account for the notification from the lab a dozen times a day, and she received one, and only one, encrypted message from the private investigator, Marcus Thorne. It was brief and to the point, making progress. Records from that period are difficult, but not impossible, to acquire. The subject had a habit of using her brother-in-law's private cottage. More to follow. The message sent a jolt through her, a confirmation that the path she was on, as dark as it was, led somewhere. She was now waiting for two truths, two separate time bombs, ticking away in the silence. The email arrived on a Thursday, just after midnight. The house was finally still, the oppressive weight of its occupants having retreated into sleep. Amelia was in her studio, unable to rest, dabbing paint aimlessly onto a canvas, the familiar motion, a small comfort in the chaos. The phone vibrated on the table beside her, and her heart leaped into her throat. The subject line on the screen was anodyne, clinical. Lab ref number 734. B. Your results are available. This was it, the first piece. The first card to be turned over in a game where the stakes were her entire future. Her hands trembled as she unlocked the phone and navigated to the secure web portal. She entered the complex password she had memorized, her breath held tight in her chest. She had to take a moment, closing her eyes, steadying herself against the wave of nausea and fear. This single document had the power to either vindicate her or utterly destroy her. With a final, shaky exhale, she clicked the link. The page loaded, a sterile white screen filled with scientific terminology, genetic markers, and strings of data that meant nothing to her. Her eyes scanned frantically, past the jargon, searching for the conclusion, the simple answer to the question that had shattered her world. And then she saw it, at the bottom of the page, in bold, unequivocal text. Analysis conclusion. The alleged father, Thomas Vance, is not excluded as the biological father of the child, Leo Vance. Probability of paternity, 99.999%. The numbers seemed to shimmer on the screen. It was over. She was right. He was wrong. A wave of something akin to relief washed over her, so potent it made her dizzy. But it was a hollow, bitter victory. There was no joy, no triumphant surge of vindication. Instead, as the reality of the words sank in, a single tear escaped and traced a slow, hot path down her cheek. It was not a tear of happiness, It was a tear of mourning. Mourning for the man Thomas used to be, for the love she thought they had, for the beautiful, simple trust he had so carelessly thrown away. This document, this absolute proof of her fidelity, was also the immutable proof of his faithlessness. It didn't heal the wound he had inflicted, it merely confirmed its depth. He had looked at their son, his son, and had allowed his mother's poison to make him doubt his own blood. In that moment, any lingering, foolish hope that their marriage could be salvaged evaporated completely. The thought of running to their bedroom, of waving this paper in his face, of watching him crumble with guilt, flashed through her mind. She imagined his apologies, his pleas for forgiveness, and she felt nothing but contempt. An apology could not unbreak what had been broken. It was too late. Her sorrow began to recede, replaced by the cold, hard resolve that had become her new companion. This document was not a peace treaty. It was a weapon. To reveal it now would be to squander its power on a fleeting moment of emotional satisfaction. It would be a cry of pain, when what she needed was a declaration of war. With methodical precision, Amelia downloaded the official report, a multi-page PDF with the lab's official letterhead. She saved the encrypted file to a hidden folder on a USB drive, which she then concealed. She printed one single, pristine hard copy. She didn't put it in a drawer or a safe where it might be found. She walked over to a large, abstract canvas she had been working on, a piece full of dark, turbulent colors. She carefully placed the folded report into an envelope, and with thick gaffer tape, she secured it firmly to the back of the wooden stretcher frame. It was the last place anyone would ever think to look, hidden in plain sight, concealed by her art. She shut down the laptop, and the screen went dark, reflecting her own face, her expression calm, her eyes clear and cold. She now possessed the first truth, and she would hold it, letting the silence in the house grow heavier, letting their arrogant certainty curdle into confusion and doubt. They had demanded proof, and she had it. But she would not be the one to give it to them. They would have to wait for the reckoning she was now planning, and they would receive the truth not as an answer, but as a judgment. With the first truth securely hidden behind a canvas of turbulent blues and grays, a strange new dynamic settled over the Vance mansion. Amelia's silence, which Thomas and Eleanor had initially interpreted as the quiet admission of guilt, had begun to unnerve them. It wasn't the silence of surrender, it was the unnerving calm of a brewing storm. They had expected her to either fight back with furious, empty denials or to crumble and negotiate the terms of her departure. She did neither. She simply waited, her composure, a mirror reflecting their own growing agitation. Thomas, unable to reconcile the loving wife he knew with the deceitful woman his mother had painted, was tormented. Eleanor, a master of control, was for the first time in a long time faced with a variable she could not predict, and it infuriated her. They were waiting for her to make a move, to show her hand, but they had no idea she was waiting for a much more powerful card to be dealt. The signal came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. A single encrypted message on her burner phone from Marcus Thorne. Package is ready. Standard procedure. Tomorrow, 4 p.m. The standard procedure they had established was a dead drop at a locker in a cavernous, little-used public library on the other side of town. The next day, Amelia feigned a need for a specific, rare type of oil paint, a believable errand that would grant her a few hours of freedom. As she drove, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm against the steady beat of the windshield wipers. This was it, the answer to the suspicion that had taken root in her mind, the potential confirmation of a secret far darker than her own manufactured scandal. She retrieved the thick, heavy manila envelope from the cold steel locker, the weight of it feeling like a slab of stone in her hands. She didn't open it, not there. She drove back to the mansion, the envelope tucked away in her art bag, a ticking bomb resting on the passenger seat. Back in the sanctuary of her studio, with the door locked and the rain lashing against the large window, she finally allowed herself to breathe. She laid the contents out on her work table. There was a professionally bound report, several pages of photocopied financial statements, a transcript of a recorded interview, and a smaller, sealed envelope labeled simply, Correspondence. Her hands were surprisingly steady as she began to read Thorne's report. The first few pages detailed Eleanor's movements in the years surrounding Thomas's birth. Her husband, Arthur Vance Sr., was frequently away on international business, sometimes for months at a time. And during those absences, the estate had a regular, very discreet visitor, his brother, Richard Vance. Then came the financial records. Thorne had unraveled a complex web of transactions showing regular payments from a Vance-owned subsidiary disguised as consulting fees into a shell corporation. That corporation's only asset was a small, secluded cottage in the mountains, a property officially owned by Richard. Eleanor had been secretly funding her brother-in-law's private getaway for years. The next section was the interview transcript. Thorne had located a former housemaid, a woman now in her late 70s, living in quiet retirement. She had been young, sharp-eyed, and terrified back then. Her testimony, given on the condition of absolute anonymity, was devastating. She spoke of Mr. Richard's car arriving late at night, of the way Mrs. Vance would dismiss the staff early on those evenings. She described the sounds of laughter and music coming from Eleanor's private wing, sounds that were never heard when Arthur Sr. was home. The maid recounted the one night she had forgotten something and returned to the wing, accidentally walking in on Eleanor and Richard in an embrace that was far from familial. The next morning, she had been dismissed with a year's salary and a cold, veiled threat about the consequences of idle gossip. Finally, with a deep breath, Amelia opened the last envelope. Inside were pristine photocopies of a dozen handwritten letters found in a rotted keepsake box in the attic of a long-neglected family summer home. Thorne had gained access under the guise of an architectural historian. She recognized Eleanor's elegant, sloping script and Richard's more forceful, masculine scrawl. They were love letters, filled with a desperate, reckless passion that stood in stark, shocking contrast to the cold, calculating woman Amelia knew. They wrote of their stolen weekends at the cottage, of their contempt for the cold and oblivious Arthur, of the risks they were taking. And then, in a letter from Eleanor dated just 3 months before Thomas was born, Amelia found the words that made the air leave her lungs. "He will never know," Eleanor had written to Richard. "This child, our child, will be raised as a Vance. He will have the name, the power, and the fortune that you and I could never have together. He will be our secret, our triumph, our perfect revenge." Amelia sat back, a wave of nausea and a chilling, clarifying rage washing over her. The hypocrisy was monumental, breathtaking in its audacity. This entire time, Eleanor's obsession with the purity of the Vance bloodline, her disdain for Amelia's supposedly common background, her crusade to protect her family's legacy, it was all a lie. A grand, elaborate performance designed to conceal the fact that the heir apparent, the cornerstone of that very legacy, was the product of her own sordid, incestuous affair. She wasn't a protector. She was the ultimate betrayer. A woman who had placed her illegitimate son on a throne he had no right to, and she had been willing to destroy Amelia and her own grandson to protect that lie. The evidence was damning, a narrative of deceit that spanned decades. A clever lawyer might try to discredit the maid or claim the letters were forgeries, but the combined weight of it all was staggering. As Amelia sat there, surrounded by the sordid secrets of the woman who had tried to ruin her, she knew it was almost enough. But for the public execution she was now planning, she needed one final, irrefutable piece of evidence. She needed something modern, scientific, unquestionable. Her gaze fell on the large canvas leaning against the wall, the one with the first truth taped to its back. She had Thomas's DNA profile. The plan solidified in her mind, brilliant and terrifying in its simplicity. All she needed now was a sample of Richard's DNA. The hunt was no longer for the truth. She had the truth. The hunt was now for the bullet to put in the gun. With the evidence of Eleanor's decades-long deception securely documented, Amelia's mission crystallized into a single, tactical objective. She needed Richard Vance's DNA. The letters and testimony painted a vivid picture of the past, but in a world of ruthless lawyers and public relations spin, they could be contested. A genetic test, however, was a matter of scientific fact. It was absolute, inarguable. It would be the final, killing blow to the myth of the Vance dynasty. This new focus transformed her. The last vestiges of the victim fell away, replaced by the cold precision of a hunter. She was no longer simply defending her honor. She was on the offense, planning an operation that required meticulous planning, flawless execution, and nerves of steel. Her target was Richard, the charming, oblivious uncle, a man who moved through life with the careless ease of someone who had never had to face a true consequence. And she knew his habits. Her opportunity came, as she knew it would, on a Sunday. The tradition of Sunday family dinner at the Vance mansion was one of Eleanor's unshakable institutions, a weekly performance of familial unity that had become almost farcical in its tension. The atmosphere that evening was particularly suffocating. Thomas was sullen and withdrawn, barely speaking. Eleanor was brittle and sharp, her eyes constantly darting to Amelia, watching her with a frustrated suspicion. And Richard was there, a caricature of forced cheerfulness, attempting to bridge the chasm of silence with loud anecdotes and tired jokes, completely oblivious to the fact that he was sitting at a table with the woman who was systematically planning his ruin. Amelia played her part to perfection. She was the ghost at the feast, quiet, demure, pushing food around her plate and offering one-word answers when spoken to. But beneath the table, her hands were clenched, and behind her downcast eyes, she was a predator, watching, waiting, her senses honed on her prey. As she had predicted, after the torturously long dinner, Thomas and Richard retreated to the study for their customary nightcap of scotch and cigars. It was a ritual of male bonding that she had always found exclusionary and faintly ridiculous. Tonight, it was her golden opportunity. She waited, her patience a coiled spring, for another 10 minutes until she heard Eleanor's sharp tones on a business call in the adjacent drawing room. Her window of opportunity was open. Taking a slow, steadying breath, she stood up and walked towards the study. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but her steps were measured and silent. She paused at the heavy oak door, schooling her features into a mask of weary distraction. Then she entered. The room was thick with the rich, cloying smell of cigar smoke. Thomas and Richard stopped their conversation, looking up at her in surprise. "I'm so sorry to interrupt," she said, her voice soft and apologetic. "I think I may have left my phone in here earlier this afternoon." She made a show of looking around the large desk, her eyes not looking for a phone but scanning the landscape. And there they were. On the small table between their leather armchairs sat 2 crystal tumblers and a heavy glass ashtray. In the ashtray, a thick cigar, still emitting a thin curl of smoke, lay next to a crushed-out stub. Richard's stub. He had just finished it. "Here, let me help you look," Richard said, ever the gentleman, starting to rise from his chair. No, please, don't get up," Amelia insisted. As she moved past the table, she made a clumsy, deliberate gesture, her elbow catching a tall stack of financial reports on the edge of the desk. Papers cascaded across the floor. "Oh my heavens, I am so clumsy," she gasped, her apology sounding genuinely mortified. As Thomas and Richard bent down to help gather the scattered pages, it gave her the perfect cover. In the 2 seconds of distraction, her movements were swift and precise. Her hand darted out, a small tissue she had palmed from her pocket already in her fingers. She deftly picked up the cigar butt, its end still damp, and in the same motion, swiped the rim of Richard's half-empty scotch glass. She clenched the tissue-wrapped evidence in her fist as she knelt, pretending to help with the papers. "I've got it," Thomas said, his voice clipped and annoyed. "It's fine." She stood up, feigning one last look. "Ah, there it is," she said, spotting her phone on a bookshelf where she had intentionally left it hours before. "So sorry to have disturbed you." She backed out of the room, her heart pounding with adrenaline, the small, precious package of truth warm in her clenched fist. The next morning, feigning another trip to the art supply store, she drove to a courier office in a town 30 miles away. The cigar butt and the sample from the glass were sealed in a sterile specimen bag she had bought online. The submission form for the lab was filled out under a pseudonym. She requested an avuncular DNA test, a comparison between the new samples and the existing profile for Thomas Vance from her previous case file. She paid the exorbitant rush fee with a prepaid credit card, leaving no paper trail. The package was sent, An invisible missile launched towards the heart of the Vance family. The final wait began. But this time, it was not a wait filled with fear or anxiety. It was the calm, patient wait of an executioner. She had done the impossible. She had the accusation, the motive, the witness, the correspondence, and now, the final, biological proof was on its way. The email arrived 4 days later. It was late, the house shrouded in a sleeping darkness that felt charged with secrets. In the blue light of her laptop screen in the studio, she opened the final report. The language was dense, a clinical landscape of allele frequencies and genetic markers. But the conclusion was as sharp and clear as a shard of glass. Analysis, conclusion. Based on the genetic profiles derived from the submitted samples, the probability that the donor, Richard Vance, presumed, is the biological father of Thomas Vance is 99.9999%. The genetic evidence is conclusive. Amelia stared at the screen, the words burning into her memory. She pulled up the first report, the one confirming Leo's paternity, and placed the two windows side by side. One document was the truth that proved her innocence. The other was the truth that proved their entire existence was a fraud. One was her shield. The other was their guillotine. In that moment, sitting alone in the silent heart of the enemy's fortress, Amelia Vance, the quiet artist, the scorned wife, ceased to exist. In her place sat a woman holding the power of total annihilation in her hands. Her arsenal was complete. All that was left was to plan the execution. With the final, damning proof secured, the world shifted for Amelia. The Vance mansion was no longer her prison, it had become her chessboard. The people within it were no longer her tormentors. They were pieces, moving in predictable patterns, blind to the intricate trap she was now meticulously weaving around them. The fear and uncertainty that had plagued her for months were gone, replaced by a singular, crystalline purpose. Her actions were no longer guided by emotion, but by cold, calculated strategy. She had been their victim, their pawn, their inconvenient problem. Now, she would become their reckoning. The first step was the most crucial. She had to lull the queen and her weak king into a false sense of absolute victory. She had to become the woman they wanted her to be, the woman they thought they had already created, broken, defeated, and ready to flee. Her performance was worthy of an award. The transformation was subtle but immediate. The quiet, unnerving defiance she had shown was gone, replaced by a convincing, hollowed-out despair. She started packing, leaving a few boxes, clearly labeled Amelia's studio, in the hallway where they could be seen. She spoke to Thomas one evening, catching him in a rare moment alone, her voice a fragile whisper. "I've been thinking," she said, her eyes fixed on the floor. "You were right. You have a legacy to protect. A family. I was never really a part of it." She let a tear, a real one summoned from the memory of her past love, trail down her cheek. "I think it's best for everyone if Leo and I just go. We'll be fine. I'll go back to my art. We can arrange something. Quiet." Thomas, a man desperate to absolve his own guilt and avoid any further unpleasantness, seized on this immediately. He saw a path to a clean, manageable end, a way to put this entire ugly chapter behind him. The relief on his face was palpable. "Amelia, I think that's for the best," he stammered, his voice filled with a weak pity that turned her stomach. Her interactions with Eleanor were even more masterful. She no longer met the older woman's gaze. She deferred, she acquiesced, she made herself small. When Eleanor made a cutting remark about her parenting, Amelia would simply nod and whisper, "You're right, of course." She was feeding Eleanor's ravenous ego, making her adversary believe she had been so thoroughly crushed, so completely outmaneuvered, that she was no longer a threat. Eleanor, basking in the glow of her apparent triumph, let her guard down completely. She saw Amelia as a piece of unfortunate business that was finally being concluded, a loose end about to be neatly tied. The two of them, mother and son, were so blinded by their arrogance and their eagerness for a simple resolution that they never once stopped to question the authenticity of her surrender. But while the defeated wife drifted through the halls of the mansion, a different woman was making powerful, decisive moves in the world outside. Amelia's second secret meeting was not with a private investigator, but with Catherine Ward, one of the most feared and respected divorce and asset attorneys in the state. Catherine was a woman who did not suffer fools, and she listened with a grim, focused intensity as Amelia laid out a sanitized, but still potent, version of her story. She spoke of the emotional cruelty, the ultimatum, the DNA test that had vindicated her, and hinted at other, more serious indiscretions within the family that she had uncovered. Indiscretions that would be catastrophic to the Vance reputation if they were ever made public. Her objective, she told the lawyer, was not vengeance. It was security. An ironclad, untouchable, and monumental trust fund for her son, Leo, that would ensure he would never need a single thing from the Vance family for the rest of his life. Catherine Ward made one phone call. It was to the head of the Vance family's legal department, a man she knew well. The conversation, as she later relayed to Amelia, was brief and chillingly polite. She mentioned she was representing Amelia. She mentioned the unfounded accusations and the subsequent definitive exoneration. And then she played the card Amelia had given her. "My client," Catherine had said, her voice smooth as silk, "has no desire for a contentious public battle. Her only priority is her son. However, in the course of her recent distress, she has come into possession of certain documents pertaining to the family's history and its lineage. She believes their contents would be of great interest to the media, but of even greater interest to your board of directors. We have a proposal for a trust we would like you to consider. I think you'll find it a very reasonable price to pay for her continued silence and discretion. The threat was never stated, but it landed with the force of a bomb. Within 48 hours, without a single negotiation, the papers were drawn up. A trust fund, so large it would make Leo one of the wealthiest children in the country, was established and activated, its management completely independent of the Vance family office. Amelia had her war chest. Her son was safe. With the finances secure, all that remained was to choose the venue for the final act, and there was only one possible choice: the Vance Foundation's annual Legacy of Hope Gala. It was the glittering jewel in the Vance family's social crown, a night where the city's elite gathered to celebrate the family's supposed philanthropy and enduring legacy. It was a night dedicated to the public performance of their own virtue. It was perfect. She approached Thomas with her final, brilliant request. "Thomas," she said, her voice filled with a feigned, noble sadness, "I don't want to just disappear. The gossip would be endless. It would be bad for the family name, and for Leo later on." She paused, letting the bait hang in the air. "The gala is in 3 weeks. What if you let me say a few words on stage that night? Nothing dramatic, just a short, graceful goodbye. I could thank you and your mother for everything, talk about starting a new chapter, and wish the foundation well. It would be dignified. It would quell all the rumors. It would show the world a united front, even as we part. It would protect the Vance name." It was an irresistible offer. The idea appealed to his vanity and his desperate need to control the narrative. He and Eleanor discussed it, and they saw it as the ultimate act of magnanimity on their part, the final confirmation of their victory. They would allow the defeated girl to make a graceful exit, and they would look like benevolent, classy rulers in the process. They readily agreed, even offering to have the event coordinator work with her to schedule her brief remarks into the evening's program. They were handing her the stage, the spotlight, and the microphone. They were personally arranging their own public execution. The web was now complete. Every strand was taut, every connection secure. Amelia looked at the gala invitation on her dresser, a beautiful piece of engraved cardstock announcing a night of celebration. To everyone else, it was a party. To her, it was a battlefield. And the guest of honor was justice. The ballroom of the St. Regis Hotel was a universe unto itself, a glittering constellation of old money and new power. Hundreds of the city's most influential figures drifted through the cavernous space, their laughter mingling with the clinking of crystal champagne flutes and the soft strains of a string quartet. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the self-congratulatory glow of philanthropy. This was the Vance Foundation's annual Legacy of Hope Gala, the absolute zenith of the family's social calendar, a night meticulously designed to broadcast their power, their grace, and their impeccable public image. It was a flawless facade, a beautiful and impenetrable fortress of reputation. And tonight, Amelia was going to burn it to the ground. At the head table, on a raised dais, sat the royal family themselves. Eleanor Vance was in her element, a queen holding court. She was dressed in a gown of deep emerald green, a fortune in diamonds glittering at her throat, her smile as polished and hard as the gems she wore. She accepted compliments with a regal grace, her eyes sweeping across the room, taking in the spectacle she had orchestrated. She was triumphant. Thomas sat beside her, looking more at ease than he had in months. He was handsome and composed in his tuxedo, the perfect image of the dutiful heir. The unpleasantness with his wife was nearly over, and he was filled with a profound sense of relief. He had chosen his family, his legacy, and he believed he had made the right, if difficult, choice. At the end of the table, Richard Vance was charming a group of potential donors, his laughter booming, his charisma on full display. He was a man without a care in the world, blissfully, fatally unaware that he was a central character in a tragedy that had not yet reached its final act. Amelia did not arrive with them. She made her own entrance, timed for a moment when the ballroom was at its fullest. A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd as she appeared in the grand archway. She was not dressed like a victim. She wore a simple, severe gown of deep crimson, a color of blood and vengeance. Her hair was pulled back, her makeup was minimal, and her only jewelry was a pair of simple diamond studs. She looked not like a woman in mourning, but like a warrior. There was a chilling serenity in her posture, a stark contrast to the woman they had all heard whispers about, the emotional, unstable artist who was on her way out. She moved through the room with a slow, deliberate grace, her eyes cool and observant. She was not here to mingle. She was here to work. She took her seat at the head table, offering a polite, unreadable smile to the family who had cast her out, and she waited. The main event of the evening was, as always, Eleanor's keynote address. When she took the stage, the room fell into a reverent silence. She stood at the podium, a picture of aristocratic benevolence, and delivered a speech dripping with a hypocrisy so profound it was almost poetic. She spoke of the values the Vance family held dear. Legacy, she began, her voice resonating through the ballroom, is not a word we take lightly. It is not about the buildings that bear our name or the numbers in a ledger. It is about character. It is about the sacred trust passed down through generations, a commitment to integrity, to honor, and to family. The crowd listened, captivated. Thomas watched his mother, his chest swelling with pride. Our family has always believed that a bloodline is a promise, Eleanor continued, her voice rising with passion. A promise to uphold the standards of those who came before us, and to leave a stronger, purer legacy for those who will follow. It is this unwavering commitment to the sanctity of our heritage that allows us to do the good work we do. She finished to a thunderous standing ovation. The applause washed over her, the adoration of the crowd a testament to the power of the lie she had lived for over 30 years. As Eleanor returned to her seat, basking in the glow, the evening's master of ceremonies, a slick television personality, returned to the podium. "Thank you, Eleanor, for those powerful words," he gushed. "Truly an inspiration." He then consulted his note cards. "And now, ladies and gentlemen, for a few special words, we are honored to welcome to the stage Amelia Vance." A wave of polite, slightly confused applause rippled through the room. Whispers broke out. This was unexpected. This was drama. Thomas and Eleanor smiled, condescending and magnanimous. This was their final, generous gesture to the defeated woman. They gestured for her to come to the stage, a public display of their grace. Amelia stood. Every eye in the room was on her as she made the long walk from the table to the stage. The air crackled with anticipation. It felt as if she were moving in slow motion, the faces in the crowd turning to watch her, their expressions a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. This was not the walk of a woman going to the gallows. This was the walk of a queen ascending to a throne of judgment. She reached the podium, and the MC handed her the microphone. She turned, and her eyes met Eleanor's, Eleanor's smile was one of final, absolute victory. She thought she was about to hear a concession speech. Thomas gave her a small, encouraging nod, eager for this to be over. Amelia's expression was serene, giving nothing away. The room quieted. Hundreds of people waited, expecting to hear a tearful, graceful farewell. They were about to witness an execution. Amelia looked out at the sea of expectant faces, then let her gaze settle on the head table, on the family that had tried to destroy her. She leaned into the microphone, its pristine surface cool against her lips. She took one slow, steadying breath, and her story began. "Good evening," Amelia began, her voice perfectly clear and steady, amplified throughout the silent ballroom. It was not the trembling, tearful voice of a woman saying goodbye. It was the calm, measured tone of a professor beginning a lecture. Eleanor spoke so eloquently just now about legacy, about the importance of honor, integrity, and the sacred truth of one's family. Her words were very inspiring, and they made me reflect on the nature of truth itself. Truth, I've learned, is not always a gentle light. Sometimes, it is a wildfire. A nervous energy began to ripple through the crowd. This was not the speech they were expecting. At the head table, Eleanor's polished smile tightened at the edges. Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Amelia's eyes found his across the crowd. As some of you may have heard through whispers, my own small place in the Vance legacy was recently called into question. A very painful question was asked. A question that cut to the very heart of my own honor, and to the identity of my son, Leo. The room was now so quiet that the faint hum of the air conditioning was audible. The polite smiles on the faces in the audience had vanished, replaced by a rapt, hungry curiosity. "But I agree with my mother-in-law," Amelia continued, her gaze shifting to Eleanor, a predator's gaze, calm and unblinking. "In a family that prizes its bloodline above all else, questions of this nature deserve definitive answers. We must follow the truth, no matter where it leads." She paused and gave a subtle nod to a technician in the wings, a man her lawyer had hired for the evening. "So, for the record," she said, just as the two enormous screens on either side of the stage, which had been displaying the Foundation's logo, flickered to life. Displayed in sharp, high definition was the first page of a laboratory report. The names Amelia Vance, Thomas Vance, and Leo Vance were clearly visible. Here is the first truth of the evening. Her voice never wavered as she read the conclusion aloud, her words echoing the bold text on the screen. "The probability of Thomas Vance being the biological father of our son is 99.999%. A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. It was a physical sound, a sudden intake of hundreds of breaths. A roar of whispers immediately followed. Every head swiveled to stare at Thomas. His face, which had been flushed with pride moments before, was now the color of ash. He looked utterly poleaxed, a man publicly shamed, his own cruel doubt thrown back in his face in front of the entire world. Eleanor's hand, laden with rings, gripped the arm of her chair so tightly her knuckles were white. The mask of composure was beginning to crack, but Amelia was not finished. "But," she said, and the single word cut through the rising chaos, silencing the room once more. "My husband's diligence in this matter inspired me. If we are to truly honor the Vance legacy of absolute integrity, then we cannot be selective with the truths we choose to tell. We must bring them all into the light." And in my own painful search for the truth, I stumbled upon another, a much older, much deeper secret that lies at the very foundation of the family you are all here to celebrate tonight. Now, true fear flickered in Eleanor's eyes. She knew what was coming. Amelia's voice softened, becoming intimate, as if she were telling a sad, forgotten story. "This is a story about loyalty and betrayal. It is a story about two brothers, the brilliant but cold Arthur Vance and his charming, passionate younger brother, Richard." She paused, letting her eyes drift to Richard's seat, where he was now frozen, his face a mask of confusion and dawning horror. "And it is the story of a brilliant, ambitious woman, Eleanor, who many years ago found herself caught between them. It is a story of stolen moments, of secret letters, and of a choice that would change the course of the Vance dynasty forever." The air in the room was so thick with tension it felt hard to breathe. Like my own story, this one also ends not with a whisper, but with the cold, hard clarity of science. She nodded to the technician again. The first report vanished from the screens, replaced instantly by the second. The names on this one were Thomas Vance and Richard Vance. The conclusion was even more stark, the percentage even higher. The crowd was silent, their eyes glued to the giant screens, reading the words that were destroying an empire in real time. Amelia let the image sink in for a full 10 seconds before she delivered the final lines. Her voice was not triumphant, not angry, not even sad. It was a voice of simple, devastating fact. So it seems the great Vance legacy, the pure bloodline Eleanor spoke of with such passion, is built on a profound and deliberate lie. Thomas, she said, her eyes finding her husband's, now wide with a terror that went beyond mere shame. Your quest for the truth is over. Your biological father is not the man this foundation is named for. He is the man who has been sitting beside you all night, calling himself your uncle. For a moment, there was absolute, perfect silence. It was the silence of a universe breaking. Then, chaos. A single woman's shriek was followed by a roar of voices, of chairs scraping, of silverware clattering to the floor. Eleanor Vance made a strangled, inhuman sound and slumped sideways in her chair, her eyes rolling back in her head as she collapsed. Thomas didn't even notice. He was staring at Richard, his face a canvas of utter devastation, his entire life, his identity, his name, all of it erased in a single moment. Richard looked as if he had been turned to stone, his face pale and slick with a sudden sweat. The room erupted. Camera flashes went off like strobing lightning. The reporters in the room, smelling the biggest society scandal in a generation, surged towards the stage. Amidst the pandemonium, Amelia's actions were calm and deliberate. She gently placed the microphone back in its stand, the soft click inaudible in the growing din. She did not look at the family she had just destroyed. Her face was serene. Her work was done. She turned, and with a quiet dignity that was more powerful than any triumphant gesture, she walked off the stage, away from the chaos, away from the noise, away from the ruins of the House of Vance. She did not look back. The aftermath of the Legacy of Hope Gala was not a slow decline. It was an implosion. The story was a media firestorm, a perfect storm of wealth, sex, and betrayal that the press feasted upon for months. Headlines screamed, "Dynasty of Deceit," and "The Vance Family's Original Sin." The company's stock plummeted in the opening bell the next morning, as investors panicked at the instability of a legacy now proven to be fraudulent. The board of directors held emergency meetings, scrambling to distance the corporation from the family that had founded it. The fallout for the architects of the lie was swift and brutal. Eleanor Vance suffered a massive stroke in the chaos of the evening and was never seen in public again, left to live out her days as a recluse in the silent, cavernous mansion. A fallen queen in a kingdom of her own making, her power and influence turned to ash. Richard Vance became a pariah overnight, disowned by the remaining family and ostracized from the social and financial circles he once inhabited. He was a ghost, haunted by a single moment of public exposure. And Thomas simply vanished. He resigned from the board, abdicated his inheritance, and disappeared from the world that had, in the space of 5 minutes, ceased to be his. Amelia did not stay to watch the empire burn. The morning after the gala, as the world was just waking up to the scandal, she was quietly packing the last of her and Leo's belongings. She took nothing that belonged to them. No jewelry, no designer clothes, no expensive gifts. She took only her art supplies, Leo's favorite toys, and the 2 documents that had bought her their freedom. She walked out of the Vance mansion for the last time without a single look back, leaving the ghosts of her past to choke on the ruins. Her new life began not with a bang, but with a quiet exhale. She bought a small, light-filled cottage in a sleepy coastal town, a place where the air smelled of salt and freedom. She started painting again, not with the desperate need of an escape artist, but with the simple joy of a creator. Her days were filled with the sound of her son's laughter, the warmth of the sun in her small garden, and the peaceful solitude she had craved for so long. She had dismantled a dynasty, not with bombs or armies, but with the simple, undeniable weight of the truth. And her reward was peace. Years passed, as they always do. The scandal faded into a notorious legend, and Amelia's quiet life remained undisturbed. Her small gallery in town became a modest success. Leo was a happy, bright young boy who knew nothing of the toxic legacy he had escaped. Then one afternoon, the past walked through her gallery door. It was Thomas. He was thinner, and the years had carved deep lines into his face. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by a simple, worn jacket. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out, the arrogance and entitlement of his youth scoured away by shame. He didn't ask for much. He just wanted to apologize, his voice hoarse with a regret that felt years too late. "I was a fool," he whispered, his eyes pleading. "She twisted everything. I was weak." Amelia listened, her expression calm and distant. The burning anger she had once felt was long gone, replaced by a quiet, sad indifference. "You weren't just weak, Thomas," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You were a coward, and cowardice is always a choice. You chose your mother's lies over your wife's honor and your son's legitimacy. That is your truth to live with, not mine." He asked if he could see Leo. She hesitated, then nodded once, a final, small act of grace, not for him, but for her son. She would not have Leo grow up thinking his mother was a gatekeeper of hate. She let Thomas watch from the gallery window as Leo played in the park across the street, a father looking at a life he had forfeited. Defeated, Thomas finally turned to leave. His shoulders slumped. And that is when the final, most exquisitely cruel twist of the knife occurred. As Thomas stepped out onto the sidewalk, a family minivan pulled into a parking spot. A man got out of the driver's seat, laughing, followed by a woman and two small children. It was David, her old friend, David, the man whose platonic friendship had been the catalyst for Thomas's entire campaign of suspicion. He and his family greeted Amelia with warm hugs, the easy, uncomplicated affection of dear friends who had come for a weekend visit. Thomas stood frozen on the sidewalk, watching them. He saw the genuine smiles, the shared laughter, the utter lack of anything illicit or secret, and in that moment, the full, devastating weight of his folly crashed down upon him. He had not destroyed his life for a truth. He had not even destroyed it for a lie. He had burned his entire world to the ground for a fantasy, a phantom of jealousy and insecurity his mother had conjured from thin air. He had sacrificed everything for a ghost, while the real, true, and beautiful life he could have had was lost to him forever. So never underestimate the quiet dignity of a person who has endured too much. For years, they may absorb the cruelty, the betrayals, and the lies in silence. But do not mistake their patience for weakness or their silence for acceptance. Because when they finally decide to speak, their voice will not just be a sound. It will be a seismic event, powerful enough to shatter an empire built on lies. Thank you for listening. Join us next time for another story from the heart of the family, where the deepest loves and the darkest secrets reside.